end of this hour, and I strongly urge you to subscribe. I served as EPA Regional Administrator during the Obama administration, and now I'm honored to be the president of Beyond Plastics. I also teach at Bennington College in Vermont, including a class on plastic pollution. It's a 1-credit class. You can audit it. Starts September 1st, 7 Wednesday evenings in a row, and go to beyondplastics.org to get registration information if you would like to audit the class or take it for 1 college credit. I want to thank my colleague, Eve Fox, who is a digital director with Beyond Plastics, for all her essential work putting this event together today. We are meeting during a climate emergency. We know that plastics is very much a climate change issue, even though a lot of people don't know that. The 6 warmest years on record have all occurred since 2014. And as much of the world is suffering with extreme heat, deadly heat this week and next, we recognize from climate scientists that this is probably one of the coolest summers that we'll be experiencing in a long time. There's so much to cover on the plastics issue, and I work with grassroots organizations and policymakers on policies to drive down plastic pollution. And we sometimes get criticized because we do work, for instance, on legislation that only allows for plastic straws to be shared upon request. And a number of people have said to me, plastic straws are so insignificant. Judith, why are you wasting your time on straws legislation? The reason is because it starts the conversation on an issue that is so broad and so complex and has not yet fully penetrated the mass media in an accurate way. So when I'm out with my friends, they're typically horrified when I speak on behalf of the whole table and say, no straws for anyone, please. And the younger wait staff will say to me, oh, because of the turtle? And I say, yes, that's one of the reasons. And then I spare the wait staff the rest of my spiel, but you're going to hear it today. It's because of marine biology that we need to reduce plastic pollution. It's also because of environmental justice concerns. We know plastic manufacturing facilities, petrochemical facilities are almost always cited in low-income communities and communities of color. Plastics is a fracking issue. Plastics is a health issue. And plastic stands in the way of moving us toward a reuse and refill economy. Plastic is everywhere. Dr. Janice Brady has done an amazing paper finding microplastics in distant national parks out west. We find microplastics in the deepest parts of the ocean, high up in the mountains. We're also seeing microplastics in our own bodies. We all consume microplastics in beverages like beer, food like honey. And this past January, an Italian scientist, a team of Italian scientists for the first time documented the presence of microplastics in the human placenta, both on the maternal side and the baby side of the placenta. How is mass media providing information to the public on this issue? That's what we want to talk about today. How is this issue framed? You'll notice differences in even the narrative. Some federal agencies, for instance, continue to talk about marine debris when grassroots environmental campaigners talk about plastic pollution. The petrochemical industry is selling us false solutions like chemical recycling, when in fact it's just high temperature plastic burning. How these issues are framed and talked about in the mass media directly affects what policymakers choose to do. Are they going to do Band-Aid solutions, or are they going to look upstream? So I'm very excited that today we have with us 4 PhDs and 1 journalist, which sounds like the beginning of a joke. 4 PhDs and 1 journalist walk into a bar. I'm sure none of them get plastic straws at that bar. They have a lot of wisdom to share with us today, and they will be introduced by Amy Brady, who is the new executive director of Orion Magazine. She's also the author of Ice, An American Obsession, A Cultural History of Ice, which will be published in 2023 by Putnam. Amy is the co-editor of the anthology House on Fire, Dispatches from a Climate Changed World, also forthcoming in 2022. I want to read both of Amy's books. So I'm delighted to introduce Amy Brady and ask her to kick us off in this exciting conversation.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you for that introduction and that sobering reminder of just how much plastics affect every aspect of our lives and our planet. I also want to thank you and Beyond Plastics for hosting this event today. I am so delighted to be here and to hear these 3 brilliant writers talk about this series and how it came together. Also, a big thanks to all of you who are joining us today or this evening, depending on from where you are joining us. I'm so glad that you could also take part in this conversation. It's very important for all the reasons that Judith mentioned and beyond. So my guess is that if you are joining us today, you probably have at least heard of Orion. But in case you're not familiar, Orion is a magazine that is dedicated to environmental writing across the genres of nonfiction, fiction, poetry, photography, and the illustrative arts. For almost 40 years, we will be celebrating our 40th anniversary next year. For almost 40 years, we have published, to my mind, some of the finest writers and artists working in the environmental space, including the folks that you will be listening to today. This series speaks so profoundly to Orion's mission. It brought together a range of writers from all different kinds of backgrounds and disciplines: an environmental journalist, a microplastics expert, a literature scholar, a social scientist, and together they expanded the scope and the depth of our understanding of how plastics were created, their history, how they affect us now, and what the future might look like on a planet where plastics are still a part of our world. So everyone at Orion was so pleased to give this series a home. I believe that you can find links to these essays over in the chat box, so check those out at your leisure. And if this series and Orion's mission to publish writing about the natural world that explores humanity's relationship with the natural world and each other, if all of this sounds like something that you want to read more about, then I encourage you to subscribe. And as a gift to all of you for being here today, I want to offer you a 20% discount for a 1-year subscription. I'm going to put that link in the chat right now. Please feel free to check it out at your leisure. Purchase yourself a subscription, or if you already are a subscriber, consider giving a gift subscription to a friend or a colleague who cares about these issues as much as you do. So regarding this series, I want to thank a couple of people before I introduce our panelists today, because this series would not have been possible without them. The first is Carolyn Fine-Friedman and the Fine Fund, who generously supported this series financially. It is not an exaggeration to say that this series would not have existed without Carolyn's support. So thank you on behalf of everyone at Orion and all of the readers who got to read this beautiful series for your generosity. This series was also the vision of Rebecca Altman, who was not only a visionary, but also the editor and a contributor to this series. Her essay was the final installment that was just published in Orion's summer issue, which hit newsstands about 2 weeks ago. So I'm very excited to introduce Rebecca and the other two panelists. So without further ado, I'll invite them to join me on screen and I will tell you all a little bit more about them. The first is Rebecca Altman, who earned her PhD in environmental sociology from Brown University. She serves on the board of directors of the Science and Health and Environment Health Network and is working on her first book, An Intimate History of Plastics, which is forthcoming on Scribner Books in the US and One World Press in the UK. Joining Rebecca is Meera Subramanian, who is an award-winning independent journalist and author of the book A River Runs Again, India's Natural World in Crisis, which was a 2016 Orion Book Award finalist. Meera has been a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT, a Fulbright Nehru Fellow in India, and a visiting professor at Princeton University. She is on the board of the Society of Environmental Journalists, where she served as president in 2020. Yes, Meera is a very big deal. And I'm also very proud to say that she is a contributing editor to Orion Magazine as well. And joining Meera and Rebecca is David Ferrier, who is the author of Footprints in Search of Future Fossils. He is a recipient of the Royal Society of Literature's Giles St. Aubin Award. And David teaches at the University of Edinburgh, where he is a professor of literature and the environment. And I think it's also worth noting that David contributed the inaugural essay of this series titled Hand in Glove, which was in Orion's fall issue of 2020. So this is a series that has been in the making for multiple years at this point. Thank you all for being here, and I'm going to let Rebecca take it away.
Thank you, Amy. Welcome, everyone. I hope I'm audible. I want to also extend, on behalf of the entire group of writers, our thanks to Carolyn and the Fine Fund for creating the opportunity to do deep, long-form work, and the importance of which I hope we can explore together today. So thank you. And also to echo our thanks to the entire operation at Orion, who helped pull this off, from the teams behind the scenes, the fact checkers who did remarkable work, all of the visual elements and layout, the folks working on that, the copy editors, everyone on the business and contract side of things, but most of all for the visionary editorial work of Sumant Prabhakar. He's very humble about things, but he's one of the finest editors working today, and also one of the finest writers. So I highly encourage you to check out his opening piece in the magazine. Is always my favorite. And last but not least, I want to acknowledge our fourth contributor, Dr. Max Lebron, who is not able to join us today. Max wrote the second essay in the series. Max has a brand new book out called Pollution is Colonialism. And I'm going to pop some links in the chat for other ways to connect with their work, because this is a voice to listen to on plastics and plastic science in particular, who's also actively doing plastic science. Okay. So this series was it's been in the works for years, and it took a while to get off the ground to envision it. But my goal with it was to kind of use the long form process to have minds dig into some of the complexities of plastics that plastics pose culturally, scientifically, in terms of historical analysis, and then to use that long form process in a particular arrangement with the editors, to have kind of me serving in this intermediary roles where I can be with them as they're diving and learning and exploring, and to be in process with them to then kind of create these longer form pieces, long form meaning multiple thousand words. And so I just want to kind of introduce some of those kind of thorny pieces they each went into, so as a way to introduce the series to those who may not know it. And again, the links to those are in the chat box. So David opened the series last fall with a piece called Hand in Glove, which functions as a sort of object lesson and uses the PPE, specifically the rubber gloves that so many of us saw lying in the curbside during the beginnings of lockdown and pandemic last year, and use that as an object lesson or prism to look into this issue of plastics as this intermediary between us and the environment, and the false promises that are offered in terms of its idea of what does it protect us from? How does it affect touch? And how is it touching us? And also, is it a way to touch through time? And so I'm sure David will talk more about that. Max Lebron came through with the second piece called Plastics in the Gut. And it's a story about being an active microplastics researcher trying to follow protocols for scooping up beach sand for microplastics, only to find themselves on a rock of an island where there's nothing scoopable. And so how does one really truly begin to do the work of understanding plastics in one's surroundings if the methods aren't quite attuned to understanding plastics? And so the work from there spins out into the story of the role of science in either documenting the harm or in further perpetuating the silences and in the way that plastic can be both ubiquitous but also uneven in its distribution of its harms. Mira's essay came up third, a beautiful essay called The Nature of Plastics. And this, in the commission originally, the idea was to ask Mira to kind of ruminate on this conundrum between the relationship between plastics and nature and culture. We see all these provocative images of the straw in the nose, of the seahorse gallivanting through beautiful blue waters with carrying a pink Q-tip, and yet as if these things are apart. But Mira took up this question of, well, what now that plastics are part of the biological and ecological reality of the world? And she started kind of teasing apart what has often been constructed as a boundary. And then I came in with the fourth essay that's just out now, which features the unexpected photography of Ansel Adams, taken inside a petrochemical plastics plant in the 1940s. And I really wanted to create an essay that challenges the conventional way plastics history are told, which is often very quickly to get out of the way to get to the rest of the story. And that often favors stories I call the F stories, the stories of plastics founding fathers, firsts, and flash in the pan moments. I really wanted to complicate actually what a difficult thing it was to invent plastic and how to scale it and how to convince customers to buy it. So it's a multi-threaded story about plastics, more complicated origins. So that's the series in total. Or as this stands, there's lots more stories that could have been told, but those were the 4 that we were able to produce at this point. So I wanted to just open the conversation up to Mira, trained as a journalist, and David, who has spent years studying literature in the environment and that role, to this idea of story. And I'd like to put out this provocative idea, right, that our brains are wired for story, and the reason we do this, the reason we write these long form pieces is to kind of package fact, experience, and data so that it may enter the brain through a different portal than just fact, data, or experience alone. And so I'd like to just open up the conversation for them to talk about the experience of entering into this essaying process with the idea of kind of taking these little bits, these objects, these little conundrums, and to start turning them in their mind, start working them on the page to create some artful form out of it so that it can then enter the public conversation through a different doorway. So Mira or David, well, David, why don't we have you go first, since you've already had to do this. Would you say a little bit more about your story, your contribution to the magazine, but also speak to kind of how you think about story and how you craft it so that it matters?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, first of all, I should say thank you for the opportunity. Beck, it was a wonderful moment when I got that email inviting me to think about how I might contribute to this series, and I leapt on it. But it did arrive at a tricky moment. You know, we were 2 months or so, I forget exactly how much, into lockdown, the first lockdown here in Edinburgh, where I am. And although I might not have said it at the time, I was definitely still reeling. You know, still properly reeling with the way that things had come to a kind of crashing halt. And I struggled with this commission for a while to try and get some purchase on it, to get a sense of what the main object of it was. And I think I came to realize I was trying to tell too much of a linear story, and that's not really what stories are. We learn when we're small, you know, stories have a beginning, supposedly have a beginning, middle, and the end. And stories aren't really linear; they're constellations. You know, they're the coming together of multiple different lines of agency and temporality and event and causation and motive and character. And I think it was in sort of allowing myself to think about telling a story that had multiple ways in. It became a bit easier to get on with this, and you know, because I was thinking so much not just about plastic generally, but plastic in this moment, plastic and how it was mediating between us and the world that was suddenly threatening us in so many new and unexpected ways. You know, that things that we would have taken for granted, you know, surfaces we would have touched without thinking, became potentially deadly. We just didn't know, and plastic was this strange material that was mediating between that was sort of mediating what we could touch and what we couldn't, what we could be in intimate contact with and what we couldn't anymore. And alongside that was a story about my grandma dying just in the very early days of the pandemic, not for COVID, but you know, in the midst of this sudden great crashing rush to close things down, and seeing her for the last time, holding her hand. And so I was thinking very much about plastic and intimacy, and how we have a very intimate relationship with plastic. It you know, if you're a carer, you'll understand how suddenly your life becomes surrounded by plastic objects, and it allows you to perform tasks of care and nurturing. But you know, there are great costs that come with that. And so, yeah, I mean, I think my thinking about story is that, you know, it's a way to gather together all these threads, all these knots in this constellation, and to discover, you know, where are the points of contact between us and the wider world? You know, where are we in intimate connection with things that we might not actually be immediately aware of?
The third backdrop to your writing this, David, you know, is you had just finished this huge book project.
Oh, yeah.
On the future of fossils, and thinking about plastics in the fossil record, which is something Mira has written about as well, and whether or not the pandemic would show up in that geological record through the deposition of
Yeah, I mean, any piece of plastic is, I mean, it's like a knot in time. It pulls together these immense time frames, you know, in terms of its origin in hydrocarbon materials and its incredible durability. And, you know, the fact that there's some, you know, the abundance of plastic means that it's an abundance of this immensely durable material, which is, as Mira explains in great and very accessible detail, doesn't biodegrade, it photodegrades, it just breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces. into the kind of nanoparticle level, it's almost guaranteed that something this widespread and this durable will leave some kind of trace in the fossil record. So we can think of plastic as well as a kind of story, a story that we're telling to the future. The abundance of this material, its presence in multiple different deposits all over the world, in the deep future, is going to tell a certain kind of story to generations who might not be born for 4,000 generations from now. What kind of world we lived in and what we valued. I think most of all, it will tell a story about what we prioritized. And if they can figure out what this material is and how we used it, they'll realize that we valued the present, we valued the immediate need more than we valued, either the people who pay the price for producing it, or the people who have to deal with the world that it's sort of a legacy in.
Mira, I came to your work through through some of your writing about trying to figure out or reporting on scientists trying to figure out where to lay the golden spike in terms of where to mark the passage to a different geological age, epoch. I'm not sure the right word. Epic, yeah. And invited you to think about another way that plastics was intersecting with science as science was beginning to think about the biological, ecological realities of plastic. And for you in particular, if you don't, I hope you don't mind me sharing, so we went back and forth about whether or not you would play a role in the narrative that you were writing, and the kind of story that you were laying out. So I was curious if you wanted to kind of also speak to kind of your own understanding of the kind of piece you were trying to create, and the work that you were trying to do with it.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me and for reaching out, when this came up, because addressing and exploring borderlands and edge zones is something that I didn't realize I was doing it, but when I look back at what I've written, I keep returning to these ideas of there being these clear delineations between the human places and the wild places, and it's disintegrating. And so I touched on plastics when I was writing for Nature about the Anthropocene designation. That is the concept of the Anthropocene has completely been embraced on a mass general level, but the scientists are still debating whether we're actually in it, and if so, what's the mark of it. And so plastics was one on the short list for possible markers. And I think it's absolutely true, as David's work shows, like that it will be in the geological, it will show up in the record. It will be there. They're leaning towards something totally different, radionuclides in the nuclear age, which I find fascinating because no one can see that. You need a really fancy machine. But the idea of thinking about how to tell the story in a way that's accessible for people. So going back to the storytelling element, there's in our early conversations back, you and I were talking about, the biological impact, the ecological impact, the geological impact. So you've got these matters of scale that are happening, from the very, very nano, tiny level to looking at deep time. And you've also got the question of how you make that story accessible to people. And that is where I think, in terms of Becky and I, conversations like, do I need to be in the story? Do I not need to be in the story? And part of it was me as an environmental journalist, someone who's been working on this subject matter for 30 years in some form or another, and writing about so many different elements of it, but I had never really written about plastics. It basically was there on the edges. So in many ways, I was learning all of this new. It was part of why I was very happy Beck was my editor for this, because she was an expert. So I could be like, this is what I'm seeing. I am just doing I'm doing, somebody called the piece wow, what an interesting lit review. Cause I really just again, COVID, I was not out reporting in the usual way that I would have been. But I was reading all the science like I do with my other work. But I really just went into it much deeper. But then you're trying to make sense of it, right? That's the glory of long form and the really powerful thing about spaces like Orion Magazine that make room for being able to put those things in context. And part of that is me figuring out what I am reading and what it means, like that the short form journalism, like you said, can deal with the objects themselves and the research in piecemeal form, but how do you bring it all together? How do you put it together and say, what does this mean for us? Because it does still seem like it still keeps coming down to these object pieces of plastic. But I mean, you wrote so beautifully about how, I think I wrote it down, you wrote how it's become, it's gone beyond just like thinking about a plastic bottle to being an integrated network laid over the landscape. And I think in my piece, I wrote something like, it's like a message in a bottle, but we're like inside of the bottle and the bottle's plastic. Like it's so everywhere. So that part was fascinating for me. And so I think it made sense finally for me that the things that bubbled up when I was reading all this lit review and I was reading all the scientific studies about what they're finding in plastics, for how long they've known that this has been a problem. This goes right back to climate, which I'm sure we'll touch upon today, of that this has been a growing problem for a long time. It's continuing to get worse rather than better. And me being in the story was just a very small part of it, but it was part of me looking back at, being a 19-year-old on a ship that just dumped all its trash off the back deck, because that's what you did, because there was always this sense that you're just sending things away. And, this piece, all of our pieces, I think really came back to the fact that there is no way. There is no way. It's always there.
I woke up to learning a lot about it, so much through your pieces, but even will confess to learning a ton while trying to draft my own. And I think that's part of this work, is that, to essay is a verb, and it is a question asking, and through the iterative drafting process, eventually your everyday mind and your writing mind, like your everyday mind starts to learn from your writing mind as it starts to do the synthetic work. And I was so, I loved, as a writer, I loved getting to watch inside your minds at work. That's such a rarity to do that, and to watch your own learning and evolve, and watch you reach for and push for new insights about plastic, such that there are these amazing pull quotes that you could pull out that are really kind of capturing kind of what plastics are in our worlds. For me, when I was writing, I knew that I wanted to write about the centennial of the marriage of petroleum and chemistry into petrochemistry. I knew that I wanted to explore the beginnings of Union Carbide, not just because it was the company that employed my father when he made plastics, but because it was one of the 20th century's biggest plastics producers, now subsumed under one of the 21st century's biggest plastics producer, which is Dow. So, and I wanted to look at its beginnings. And so I, it's like the essay started as like a tack board of all of these like disparate things that I wanted to, like a television series detective, begin to do the threading, or to make those the constellation that David talked about, not fully knowing that I'd be able to come to any insights. And I think what was interesting for me was this engagement with the photography. I was working with the photographs of Anvil Adams as data really, and seeing like, why is he going back and forth between this metals factory and this plastics factory, and then realizing like, oh my gosh, a plastics factory is a bunch of specialty metals all welded together, and then to beginning to understand like everything that enabled plastics. I mean, there's so many different contributing tributaries that flow into that river. And that revelation kind of, it wouldn't have occurred to me if I just sat here, I had to be actively engaged in reading, in writing, to kind of really understand just how how many co-inventions had to come together to make modern plastics possible. And then to spend the time to figure out, well, now how do I write this in a way that can share that with others? So I'm curious about either of your processes, of kind of how you came to kind of the deeper understandings about plastics that you came to understand, and kind of the insight that you feel like you're able to offer readers.
Mira, do you take that one first?
Yeah, I mean, it's horrifying to spend time inquiring down this road. Like, it's really, it is terrifying. I mean, the what Judith referred to about finding microplastics in placentas. When I was doing the research, that was like suspected, but they hadn't conclusively. It was literally as it was going to press that study came out. And just knowing that, you know, every 6 months there's going to be new data about where this synthetic material is in the world and how it's interacting with everything, you know, and there's, you know, we don't have to always be dark. Maybe it's fine. Maybe the science will reveal it's not as harmful as it could be. But right now, they're endocrine disruptors. They're affecting all sorts of things about biology. They're affecting how species are interacting with each other, with their environment. They're changing ecosystems. Things are moving around the world on the nano level and on the macro level in totally different ways. So, I mean, we talk about microplastics, we talk about macroplastics. I think we would need to talk about metaplastics, like just the idea of this being everywhere. And so, I don't know, what was your question? It's terrifying. That learning about this stuff is terrifying, and it's hard to write about it. You know, it's emotionally hard because it's just like writing about the climate. You know, in order to educate and learn what you need to learn, you dive into the facts in a way that most people do not have either the luxury or the punishment of getting to do as a journalist or a scholar. And it's scary what's out there. And you know, I mean, I've had friends who, you know, gave birth last Saturday who read the piece and have to like carry this knowledge into bringing their child into the world, knowing that this is the world that we've created for them, right? So that's incredibly difficult. So there's that part. But the hope is that, again, that these longer stories give a context that makes us go way beyond just the objects and start thinking about them in this big way. And I always think of like Rachel Carson was reading a lot of papers that were all about chemicals, this chemical and that, just reading a bunch of separate papers. And it took her synthesizing that and writing Silent Spring to make that into something that people cared about, that people like, that made our storytelling brains that can only like, don't do so well with academic studies, but do well with imagining a town where all the birds have died because of this thing that we've done. That's powerful. And that's where, I mean, in terms of my education and also trying to balance the emotional weight of doing this work, all kind of come together. But David, how did you manage it?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. The first thing to say is it's difficult, and it's difficult to contemplate plastic because it's overwhelming. You know, the scale of damage, potential damage, is very difficult to be reconciled to. But it's a difficult substance to think with. More generally, plastic is very elusive. It tries to evade our gaze. You know, we're encouraged not to look at plastic, but to sort of look beyond it. You know, we don't think about the plastic we use. It's a substance that, you know, and I think both of your essays in different ways give the story to this, but has been very deliberately naturalized over the past, 70 years or so. So I found it much easier to come at this obliquely. And I was thinking much more about touch in the essay than I was about plastic, at least initially. And that helped me to think about the way in which we encounter plastic, rather than plastic itself as an abstract substance, but rather something that we are engaging with. And how are we doing that? But it also brings in other kinds of touch as well. The touch between me and my children. The ways in which the different kinds of touch, a lot of which we were prevented from doing. You couldn't hug friends, you couldn't hug wider family members when I was writing this. These are also different kinds of touch that compose us, make us who we are. So it was helpful to counterbalance that sense that the plastic is this substance that's touching us in all of these so often quite compromising ways. With this other sense of touch as something that actually composes us and sustains us and gives us hope. So yeah, I found plastic's a difficult thing to write about, but I found it to kind of come at it sideways was a way to open up the subject.
Yeah, Beck, can I ask you a question? I mean, you've been, I feel like a newbie in terms of really diving in and writing about this, but you have been exploring this issue for so long. And your piece talks about how you wanted to write about plastics and it's kind of was like a non-thing. So you ended up going more towards the PFAS direction and other chemicals that basically led you full circle right back to plastics. And so, and multiple of us have talked about Ed Carpenter's work, that they were finding microplastics in the ocean, 40 years ago. So it's like in terms of like being ahead of the curve of recognizing this. So I'm curious what you think the trajectory is of how people will be thinking about plastics. Like, what do you think this conversation is going to be like in, I don't know, in a decade? Like, do you have any sense of that?
No, I mean, I have kind of curiosities, but like, for example, I was reading this morning, I think in The Guardian, about all of these climate lawsuits that are unfolding at different levels of jurisdiction in the United States. And I look at that and say, oh my gosh, think of all the documents that are going to come forward through that discovery process. Yeah. In the United States in the 90s, when the attorneys generals got together and sued the tobacco company, I mean, it opened up millions of pages of documents so that researchers, and this is actually how I got my start doing early, I was working in tobacco documents to begin to understand how that industry worked. I can only imagine the insights that will become available about plastics as these lawsuits roll forward, and many of these oil and fossil fuel companies tied into plastics file cabinets get open. I think the biggest part of understanding this moment is the sourcing that is available to those of us that are trying to do this work are limited, arcane, inaccessible, to be able to kind of open up and really understand kind of the roots and to really understand how it is that plastics production got entwined with fossil fuel production. I say all this because I think we're in this moment of like, can these things be decoupled? Can material production, like what will material production look like when the economics of fossil fuel production shift? What are the things of everyday life going to be made out of? And so I've kind of thought a little bit about that as well. So just in terms of kind of what are we going to come to understand at this moment, but also what will the materials of the future be? Because there's been this coupling, even before fossil fuels, of kind of the material world being made from some of the byproducts of the energy systems, including biomass and tree materials and coal and into natural gas. And so, I mean, I'm kind of curious about how that's going to all unfold. And I say that not because I'm a historian, but, I studied body burden, and it's very tricky science for the scientists to do. And as a social scientist, I think one of the answers is to read the body as an archive of industrial policy and geopolitics. So, those are kind of two bigger trends that I've got my eyes on. I also have my eye on the time. It's probably time for questions. This goes so fast, doesn't it?
Have I got time to ask you what it was like when you found those Ansel Adams photographs? Because they're such an incredible discovery and such a powerful moment in the piece.
Oh, I know. I was working on another piece like years ago for the Atlantic on the industrialization of carbon, and was rifling through the footnotes of a colleague's book on the kind of rise of the organic chemicals industry. And it was like a footnote that Fortune magazine back in the 40s had done a 3-part series about Union Carbide. And I was like, that's interesting to me. My dad worked there. Not ever knowing I'd want to be writing a book about this. And so I like found them on eBay for, whatever, $11 or something. And, read them. That was cool. Maybe I pulled them out again and, saw, all of a sudden realized like 4 pictures in that there was a little byline, photos by Ansel Adams, and I leapt out of my chair. Like, what? Are there 2 Ansel Adams? What? So anyway, and then I just kind of kept coming back to them, never knowing if I'd have a chance to write about it. But all of a sudden I'm writing a story about somebody kind of trying to go understand carbide. And so the poet Muriel Rukeyser tried to understand carbide. And I was like, oh, I'll pull that in. And I ended up getting to read about Ansel Adams going to make those photographs and an oral history he did. Then the trick was, how would I tie these stories together? And then Sumant at Orion was like, we should go get his pictures, which that's never going to happen. And I don't know how he did it. Are you here? If you're here, you should come and say hello. He got the Ansel Rights Publishing Trust to let Orion publish these pictures, which is just tremendous. They're incredible photos taken inside an early petrochemical plant.
They really are.
Rebecca, I just want to mention we've only got 10 minutes.
Yep.
If you want to explain how people can pose questions in the chat.
I think it says, looks like the Q&A is open, and I see one question in there. And I'm going to read it, all right? How do we imagine, literally, a future without plastics in the mid-range time frame and in 10 to 5 years? How do we imagine?
Stop falling for the myth of convenience. I think that's part of it. There's just such a we lived without plastic as humans for a very, very, very long time. And there's, as Beck's and other people's work about the history of plastics, like they were made to seem like they were essential. They were deemed essential objects, but by corporations, not by humans demanding that they needed them. And it is complicated. There are things that are positive about them. When we're talking about global emissions, shipping plastic is less weight than shipping glass. And there are all these complications, but I was teaching in Kenya a decade or so ago. And when we were out in the field, everything we had was, waxed canvas, the garbage can, the everything, like it wasn't that hard to not use plastic everywhere, the way that we kind of seem to think that it is now.
Yeah, it's that sense of it being of convenience leading, sort of sliding into essential needs. And of course, for some people, plastics are essential. To be purist about this and insist upon a world entirely free of plastics is a kind of ableist narrative in a sense, because for some people plastics is a matter of life or death, not simply a matter of greater or lesser convenience. And it's important, I think, to remember that in all of this. But I think Mira's absolutely right that we downgrading the kind of the urgency of whatever needs plastic, or in everyday terms, purports to meet, I think is an essential start. Thinking about plastic as something that connects us as well, rather than something that separates us. I think we tend only to see plastic when it's in our hand and to sort of forget it the moment it leaves. But in actual fact, what we're kind of touching a whole range of connections that stretches to the people who have to deal with that waste when it lands in Kenya, or lands in Bangladesh, or lands in parts of China, wherever our waste goes, when away crystallizes into somewhere real. that's that's a connection that we carry with us. And I think we, maybe substituting convenience for a sense of connectedness is a strong step towards that.
I hope to just to add to that, there's other questions coming in on the same theme. If you kind of pull back to the early years of plastic and you watch it move into the world, you realize very quickly that plastic is not plastic is not plastic. I mean, you can watch kind of like each different class of resin kind of come out, and then it's applied here, and then here, and in here, and in here, and here. And so it's like we have to work in the reverse of that. In that you kind of, but you have to understand that the plastics, they're created in an integrated network where they'll share the same feedstocks. And so at the same time, if you cut off here, that flow is going to have to route somewhere else unless you address it here. So there's kind of those two different mental images that I kind of often hold in tension to understand the work ahead, which is both kind of reversing that pattern of development, but also really understanding that if you just cut off this flow, that feedstock is going to flow somewhere else, potentially just into waste or flare, but still it's going to go somewhere. And so part of the reimagining of plastics is to really kind of get it at its root. And Judith is here and is part of coming up with kind of policy models for thinking about some of this. All right, I have a queue of questions. Oh, they all just came in. Boom, 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 boom. The journalist Anya Krieger is here of the fabulous podcast, The Plastisphere. I don't know if any of you listen, but you should. It's wonderful. Saying, how about a series of scenarios of the future ecologies of plastic? How can we detangle the entanglement while understanding it as part of a bigger process of human-made global change? I'm going to read a couple together, and we can try to tackle them. How do we deal with the idea that plastics can work out as a better or more ecological than other materials when submitted to a life cycle analysis, which is something you were just talking about, Mira? How do you reconcile these kind of different moral issues with more or less efficiency and greenness? Because there is that. Judith, is that something you want to speak to?
Sure. Yeah. I think a big mistake is thinking of the waste issues alone. I think we have to look at production, and that petrochemical facilities are sited in low-income communities and communities of color, and that has profound health impacts of people living in those communities. So I think if you look at production, use, and disposal all together, I think it's hard to argue that plastic is a superior material from an ecological or health perspective. I mean, it's handy for a large company that starts with A that ships all over the world. By the way, that company doesn't use plastic in India because of a law there. And yet when you talk to them, they look at a very narrow view. It's lighter, it's cheaper to ship, and then they put misleading labeling on the outside of the package. I'm talking about the Amazon blue and white shipping envelope that we've all seen that has the iconic recycling logo on it. Good luck recycling that. So, there's actually not a lot of choice involved here. If you are a very careful consumer, you can't avoid a lot of plastic. So I don't think it's productive for people to feel guilty about their own plastic use. I think it is productive to look how the future of plastic is intimately tied to the future of the fossil fuel industry. Fossil fuels are mostly used for electricity production and transportation. We have a resurgence in renewable energy sources. It's really cheap to put up solar and wind these days, not so cheap on geothermal. But we're shifting toward clean renewable energy. We're electrifying the transportation fleet. So the demand for fossil fuel is reduced for electricity and transportation. And therefore, plastic production is the plan B for the fossil fuel industry. This is where they see their growth market. None of us got to vote on that. These are investment decisions made years ago in corporate boardrooms. And we are way behind in explaining the climate change plastics connection. So I think, you know, focusing on that is really important. And again, I can't emphasize enough where these petrochemical facilities are sited is almost always low-income communities of color. And that has to be front and center in this policy debate.
And that speaks to the question that Anya, the second part that Anya asked, which is that, you know, given the number of environmental challenges going on and their entanglement, you know, what is the first act of systemic change that can begin to kind of
yeah, and ending fossil fuel subsidies would make a big difference. I was on a call this morning with Department of Energy, and you may not think of this as a fossil fuel subsidy. President Biden says, you know, he wants to reduce fossil fuel subsidy. Department of Energy put out an RFP for funding for chemical recycling, which is, you know, really a failed technology. It's mostly taking waste plastic and trying to turn it into fuel, not plastic to plastic. So I think, you know, you talk to restaurant owners, they don't feel good about all the plastic they're using, a lot of them, but they say it's cheap and they need alternatives that are affordable. So I would also urge people to take a look at the website Upstream Solutions. They just published a major report on the economic benefits of shifting to refillable and reusable packaging. Packaging is about 40% of the waste stream. It's often the source of litter. I'm not against all plastics, but I've never seen, for instance, you know, a car bumper on a beach. Making car bumpers out of plastic improves fuel efficiency, but I sure see a lot of fast food packaging and plastic bottles and bags and straws and cigarette butts and plastic balloons on the beach. And there are lots of alternatives there. They'll be more affordable once we stop subsidizing fossil fuel production.
The bumper comment reminded me of a colleague has a book out. Allison Cobb is a poet, has a book out called Plastic and Autobiography, in which a car bumper somehow materializes on her family's front lawn and launches her into the book. And it has a fantastic ending with said car bumper that can't make this stuff up. So that's another chance to kind of read into another kind of story. But I found that really too good of a not to mention.
Yeah, can I jump in that to Anya's question and what we're saying? Like, it is addressing, like Beck talking about, just cutting the trunk, like getting down to the roots of it, and that is the your piece, the great image of like people just keep pulling bodies out of the river, and we need to go upriver to figure out why all the bodies are ending up in the water. You know, that's so critical. But to Anya's question about how do you tackle this with thinking about biodiversity and thinking about social justice and all the different elements, like they are so intertwined. Like that is where the storytelling helps. Like hopefully that is what we're doing, is connecting the dots, making those constellations, so that you can see that it's not a separate issue, that it's all very, very much intimately connected. I think that's where we just more and more stories, like the fact that artists and poets are entering this space on top of academics and researchers and scientists, feels like we're heading in the right direction, at least in that respect. But it's there's a long road ahead. Yeah.
looking at some of the other questions that are coming in, just a comment, phones and computers are allowing us to participate in this conversation. And I find that kind of so interesting historically, since some of the earliest uses of plastics were in wire coatings and enabled connectivity and worked to, like the phrase of the 19th century was annihilate space and time and to bring us into conversation. And then at some point, kind of plastics, as with other categories of materials, aluminums and papers, moved in towards disposability, that was an invention as well that had to be trained and taught into a population, that you could take a manufactured good and so yeah, I mean, I can't remember the statistics of electronics and electronic components in terms of plastics, but for I think Janet, you might know the statistic, but for packaging and food production, it's like 40% of global plastics are going towards disposable or short-term use, predominantly polyethylene, polypropylene packaging, and which is why that's a focus. If you can kind of address that, then you start to change the supply side of the production.
Yeah, and a lot of plastic is used for durable goods. You don't use the computer and the phone once. Although we do have to do a lot of work on right to repair.
Yeah.
When your phone isn't working, how about not having to buy a new phone every time? But I think for starters, wouldn't it be nice to make progress on substantially reducing the use of single-use plastic packaging? That is what's capturing the attention of a lot of people, because I've never met a plastic pollution denier. I've met many climate deniers, but plastic pollution is everywhere. It's on city streets, it's on beaches, the bags are up in trees, even remote areas, you see plastic pollution. So it's hard to make a credible argument that it's not a problem. Rebecca, you're on mute.
There's a question here about how toxic is most plastic, and do we have compelling evidence of its impacts on human body burden? What about microplastics? And we can add nanoplastics. Mira, is that a question you want to begin?
Yeah, I mean, there's they just keep discovering more and more. So it's very much an unfolding field. They know that plastics both, they act as a sponge. So they're both absorbing toxic material from its surroundings, like a brand new nurdle, the little plastic pellets that are like the feedstock of making all the other stuff. If that goes into the ocean, it absorbs PCBs and other chemicals, right? So then if a fish or something like that eats it, then you've got that going in. So again, you're thinking about balance and equilibrium all the time. So these things are being both absorbed and releasing the materials. And so that is leading researchers to be fairly sure that there is interaction. We also know that they are, do get to the nano level in terms of going through blood vessels. They can be brought in through vascular tissue, so into plants. So there's a lot of data that there's interaction, and there's this research seems to be leading towards that interaction is not unharmful, just because they carry, and it's not, this comes up in I think all of our pieces in some way or another. It's not just the plastics themselves, it's all of the stuff that makes plastic do all the things that we think of that makes it a wonder material, to make it colorful, to make it bendy, to make it rigid, so it or it can go into the ocean and never break down. Like all of those different things are plasticizers and flame retardants and additives. So there's all this other material. When we talk about plastics, it's just not, it doesn't stop there. And so all of those things as well add to what kind of health impacts those might be having on humans and any other living beings. So yeah, it's not definitive. Just like trying to tease apart any health issue is incredibly, incredibly difficult. Any epidemiologist will tell you how difficult it is to say this causes this, but the indication is that they are endocrine disruptors. They have effects on fertility and other human biological systems. And there's the belief that they are harmful, but they're still discovering day by day what that might really mean.
If I could jump in,
Yeah,
on the Beyond Plastics website will be a recording of a webinar we did on May 12th, the plastic invasion on reproductive health. And we had Dr. Shauna Swan speak. She's the author of the book Countdown. It has a whole chapter on plastics. And we had the author, one of the co-authors of that Italian study. The remarkable thing, though, is how widespread plastic is used in consumer products and how little we know about the impact on human health. The little bit we know is raising some flags, but it always ends with, but we need to do more research. So I am not a medical doctor, but I am willing to go out on a limb and say that I would like no plastics inside my body, please. Limited studies, 100% in stool samples, limited studies, it's showing up in lung tissue. We have the first placenta study. A pattern is emerging, and I think it's time to look at the precautionary principle, which is really not part of US policymaking. That's a whole other webinar. But I think it's perfectly reasonable, particularly for women of childbearing age, to say they would like not to have plastics in their bodies.
I'd also add, just from a data perspective, we have very good data on the toxicity of styrene, vinyl chloride monomer. I mean, these are the basics for making plastic. This is what gets polymerized, and workers have borne the brunt of that for a long time. The basic building blocks for many of the major categories of resins are carcinogenic, and that's just for starters. I know I know, David, you want to jump in. I just wanted to give a quick note to Eve. Can you put in the chat info to Upstream that Janet mentioned, and a link to the class, Janet's class? There are folks asking for that. Okay, sorry, David, you look like you wanted to say one
no, I
thing.
just wanted to jump in from a kind of literary critical perspective. You mentioned a poetry collection that people could read, and just on the point of a fantastic book of poems that addresses precisely this issue about plastics invading the body. Adam Dickinson's book Anatomic is wonderful. It's something that I spoke to Adam for my piece, and I write a little bit about it. But essentially, he became interested in how much plastic was in his body, so he had a whole series of tests done to find out what he had absorbed, where it had come from, how it was interacting with his body and his microbiome, and he produced a whole book of poems as a result. And it's a fascinating, astonishing, troubling in many respects story, but one that I'd highly recommend. It really does. It
the name
tells
again?
a whole body story. Anatomic by Adam Dickinson.
I put a link in the chat to anyone who's interested.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I should have had a copy to wave around, but
he has another collection.
The polymers.
Mm-hmm. The polymers.
Yeah.
To see the way a kind of poet and another poet renders these stories. Well, we have more questions than time allows to answer. They keep going. Thank you so much for everyone to be here. But it's probably time to wrap up, or should I keep going, Janet?
I think we should wrap up.
Yeah.
And this could go for hours.
Well, I will again extend my thanks to both of you for working on this with me, and invite you all to consider more of Max's work. Max wrote an amazing piece in Teen Vogue. There was actually a question about how to engage younger audiences. I would check out. There's a link. If you go way up the chat, I put a link to a piece that Max Lebron did for Teen Vogue. It's pretty amazing. And I thank you all for engaging with us in this series, and Beyond Plastics for hosting. I hope lots of folks go over there and check it out and find ways to tap in if you're in the US. If you're joining us from elsewhere, feel free to reach out to Beyond Plastics or to us on Twitter, and maybe we can help connect you with groups working in your area.
Thanks, everyone. This was a really rich conversation.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to
everyone.
explore this and talk about it and share with everyone today.
Thanks for hosting so brilliantly, Beck, as well.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to Beyond Plastics and Orion.
Yeah.
Orion. Oh, everyone, I hope you take a deep breath. Drink